Well, if you haven't watched chapter 21, you're going to get a good historical perspective that's going to help us understanding chapter 22. This chapter 22, is a continuation of this conversation that God is having with Jeremiah, saying, "You need to go tell the people these things. Here's my message to send out to the people," basically. So we end at chapter 21 with Jeremiah taking a message to the king about what he should be doing, what are the problems and challenges that are happening there. And now we're going to get more of that here in this chapter here. So verse 1, "Thus saith the Lord, go down to the house of the king of Judah and speak there this word." And so this is Jeremiah being commanded to go tell another prophecy to the king. Now it's interesting, as it says to go down to the house of the king of Judah. So we could look at this and say maybe Jeremiah was at the temple, which was placed on a higher level, upper area. And so he's at the temple and he's praying, probably meditating on the messages of God. And this is the message he's been given. So he's going to go downhill from the Temple Mount down to the palace, where he will then talk with the king. Now, of course, the king of Judah at this time is Zedekiah. This is during that siege time around 588, 587 BC. We try to explain all that out in the last chapter. So verse 2, "And say, hear ye the word of the Lord, O King of Judah, that sittest upon the throne of David, thou and thy servants and thy people that enter in by these gates." So this is to you, the king, and the people around you that are the kingship, the people that are there. Remember, the throne of David is talking about this idea of the Davidic line, that David was promised that a great king who will rule forever will come through his loins, which we think of as Jesus Christ. That the book of Matthew tries to really make that connection strong with genealogical records. Luke tries to do that as well. But that's what happens. Okay, so remember, Zedekiah is the uncle of the previous king, who is the son of the previous king, basically. So some people saw Jehoiachin as the rightful ruler, and not so much Zedekiah, but that's just kind of some of the things that are happening at the time. Verse 3, "Thus saith the Lord, execute ye judgment and righteousness, and deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor. And do no wrong, do no violence to the stranger, the fatherless, nor the widow, neither shed innocent blood in this place." So this verse 3, is basically God explaining, reminding the king, these are the things you're supposed to do as king. This is how a king works, basically. So when you look at this, execute judgment and righteousness. So be objective in what you're doing and make it fair for the people. Do as much you can to be equitable and fair for the people. Deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor. You should be saying, if this person is oppressing somebody else, you need to deliver them out of this hand so he can't oppress people. Sometimes we think about this from a standpoint of bully victim idea, but this could be parent child, this could be employer employee, this could be neighbor over neighbor. There's a lot of things here, and it was the king's job to say, nope, we need to stop. You need to stop making yourself better at their expense. Let's bring them out and protect them so that you can be more equal. Okay, do no violence to the stranger. So when the strangers would come in, when they would come into the city, they should be welcomed. You shouldn't have problems with the strangers, basically. The fatherless as well. Don't do violence against the fatherless, nor the widow, who is a woman with children that has no husband, I should say, so husbandless. Neither shed innocent blood in this place. So that's getting into this idea that people shouldn't die unjustly. You don't put the righteous to death just to get them out of the way so the wicked can do more wickedness, basically. So this is kind of a really good insight into what are some of the major problems in their society. Now here's an interesting quote from Thompson's book. He says, "The first words from the Lord through Jeremiah to the king, his officials, and other people going in and out of the king's palace are, act with justice and righteousness. The two nouns in this phrase are the focal point of Jeremiah's message to the king and court and are worth a close examination. The first, mizpat, is a rich term with many meanings related to litigation, act, place, process, legal case, and legal decision. Laws and ordinances and rights under the law. In the more than 400 occurrences of this term in the King James Version, this masculine noun is most often translated as judgment. But that word choice doesn't reflect the depth of the word in our current vocabulary. No single term expresses it perfectly, but justice is probably the best fit. God can demand mishpat of us because he is a God of mishpat. He can ask us to be just because he is just, basically. He judges the whole earth with justice, and he reflects in his own actions his just claims and expectations for our treatment one toward another. Mishpat is the foundation of the Mosaic Law, Deuteronomy 33, including its offerings, where mishpat is translated as the manner in King James Version. Even the breastplate worn by the high priest is called the breastplate of mizpat, Exodus 28, signifying the need for the high priest to consider what is in his heart when rendering judgment. The second noun, tzedakah, is so linked to mizpat that they lie together at the very heart of a true understanding of the biblical world and life view. This feminine noun is often translated as righteousness, but like mizpat, tzedakah can have several nuanced meanings, including justice, being made right, deliverance, and blameless behavior. It represents deeds not obligatory upon the doer. The term tzedakah is tightly linked to the covenant. Tzedakah is the execution of covenant faithfulness and the covenant promise. God's righteousness as his judicial reign means that in covenant faithfulness to his people, he vindicates and saves them. When Jeremiah challenges the people at the royal house to act with mizpat and tzedakah is detailed below, he is declaring that because of the Sinaitic covenant of the Israelites made with God, they are to treat those around them according to what is right and just. In Jeremiah 22:9, envisioning the city's future destruction, some ask why Yahweh would do this. But others answer, because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord their God. So that wasn't from Thompson's book. Sorry, that was David Lefevre in his article, Justice and Righteousness. That's really interesting to see just those two words, execute judgment and righteousness, how much there is. That's the beauty of Hebrew, is there's almost a discourse in every word because of all the meanings it can possibly have. So really what it comes down to is the king is to be the neutral, objective, deciding voice in debates and discussions. He is to be the protector of those who can't protect themselves. He is to help make sure things are just and equitable for the people. And none of that is happening. Basically, the wicked are getting away with wickedness, the rich are getting richer, and everybody else is being oppressed. That's the problem with their society and what's happening. There's the interesting thing that Kent Lefevre says in his Justice and Righteousness article as well about do no violence to the stranger. He says the term for alien is ger, meaning a sojourner, foreigner, or a new arrival. Today we might say refugee because a ger was someone who was driven from home by war, famine, or pestilence, one who sought shelter in another village or with a different tribe where his or her rights were likely curtailed. The Mosaic covenant requires fair treatment of people coming in from outside the Israelite culture. That's Leviticus 19. But Jeremiah proclaims that those in the palace, his audience, as shown in verse 1, were treating people from outside their kingdom with oppression and violence. So again, they were not taking care of the strangers and the refugees and the people that were coming in. And then we get into the idea of widow, and it says, because, Kent Lefevre said this too, because wives with no husband and children with no father had few legal rights in their society, caring for widows and orphans required extra effort on the part of the people. Scripture made clear that caring for these individuals was an important part of the covenant and was expected of the people, and Jeremiah continued to teach that consistently, whether directing his comments at palace officials or making other pronouncements throughout his ministry as mentioned below. So helping the fatherless and widows was important because, again, in their day and age, the women didn't have a lot of individual rights. You had to have a father or a husband that helped you with those rights. Even in a situation where no father or no husband was there, the oldest son of the family would be the one that would have the rights to the family. And even the mother would have to deal with the son to deal with those rights, basically, which I'm sure made for some really awkward family situations from time to time. So dealing with the fatherless are dealing with children who've lost their father, so they don't have a lot of rights. These people were often instantly oppressed, instantly brought down because it was hard for them to get a living without having a father. And same with widows. If a woman couldn't necessarily work on her own without having a man there, so that it made it hard. She couldn't argue for property rights or other things like that because she didn't necessarily have those. Her children would have those. So the laws of how they did things back then was very different than what they do today. But the law of Moses, this is important. Always understand this, okay? No matter how you look at the craziness of the culture of the people, you have to understand that the law of Moses, which is the law they were given, was very rarely ever perfectly followed. Most of what we see of the people in ancient times is a very altered, very manipulated way of using the law of Moses. They didn't live the true law very well. If they did, it would be a much different world for them, but they didn't. So that's part of the problem here. We can't say it was the law of Moses that failed the people. The law of Moses created the culture they did. It was the people not following the law of Moses that created the culture and problems that they had. So important. If you want to understand that, we did all the videos on Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and then you can go watch those videos and go through chapter by chapter what really was taught in the law of Moses. So watch those videos, go back and get in those videos if you want to get into that more. So let's talk about this idea of shedding innocent blood in this place. The reference to innocent blood is what is known as judicial murder, where someone is killed through abuse of the legal system, which is a consistent charge of Jeremiah against the king, his leaders, and now the people in general. So that's another thing that Kent Lefevre said about this verse as well. So again, people are being killed not because they're guilty, but because they are in the way of the people who want to become powerful and rich. That's part of the problem. They're using the judicial system not to be fair and equitable, but to make themselves wealthier, to get people out of the way so they can build and grow and do more themselves. Totally Master Mahan principle stuff going on here. The Master Mahan principle is just rampant through Jerusalem and society. Now it's interesting when you think of verse 3. If for LDS people, you should look at verse 3 and go, this is what Nephi is trying to tell his brothers that's wrong with the society. If you remember, there's a big debate in the beginning of the Book of Mormon, early in the chapters, between Nephi and his brothers, because his brothers are like, no, the people in Jerusalem were righteous. They were following the laws. They were doing the sacrifices. They were doing things. They are a good people. Everything is fine. Don't worry about it. Why are we out here in the desert? Let's go back. And Nephi's going, no, 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 no. You don't realize how wicked and deplorable and bad these people are. And God is going to destroy them because of their wickedness. What was it they're doing that was wicked? Verse 3 explains it pretty thoroughly. These are the problems they were experiencing. Now, hopefully you look at verse 3 and go, are some of those in our society today? Maybe. I think we have some of those problems in our society today. So think about this. Who, from a political standpoint, could help us make sure that these things don't happen? How can we improve our society, not keep going in the direction it's going? Anyways, verse 4. For if ye do this thing indeed, so this is the king basically saying, or not the king, sorry, God saying, okay, if you do these, basically, okay, for if you do this thing, all the things in verse 3, if you correct society and you reverse what you're doing and you go You go the opposite of where you're going, basically. So that means you actually do execute objective judgment and righteousness. You actually do help people who are oppressed to get out of oppression. You actually do be nice to strangers and the fatherless and the widows and help them out. And you make sure that nobody dies that isn't truly guilty. If you change and do these things different, then shall there enter in by the gates of this house kings, plural, sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, he and his servants and his people. So this is saying, if you guys repent and change your society, God is going to make sure your society lasts a long time and thrives and does well. Verse 5 though, but if ye will not hear these words, I swear by myself, saith the Lord. Because who's God going to swear on? Everyone wants to swear on their own heads or on God's heads. Who does God swear on? Himself. I swear by myself, saith the Lord, that this house shall become a desolation. There's the absolute. There's the choice that Jeremiah was given, and the ruling class, basically. You guys need to completely change what you're doing, how you're doing it, or it's over. Now, we could look at this and say, this is God giving kind of an extra olive leaf, extending a little mercy to the people, because theoretically, if they did say, oh, we're apologizing, God, we're sorry, we will change and do this, then maybe that would have worked and they wouldn't have had the Babylonian destruction. I think what probably happened when the people heard this is they went, there's no way we're changing. So we have to try to find a way to justify what we're doing and convince ourselves that Jeremiah is wrong. So again, this is them not willing to be open to looking at new truth. This is them trying to find a way to justify what they believe in, basically. And that's what they end up doing, ultimately, as we know from history. All right, so verse 6, for thus saith the Lord unto the king's house of Judah, thou art Gilead unto me, and the head of Lebanon. Yet surely I will make thee a wilderness and cities which are not inhabited. Now let's kind of unpack this verse for a second. That might sound strange. What does it mean to be Gilead and the head of Lebanon? So Gilead and Lebanon are represented as wealthy places that are very worldly. These are very prosperous economies in the ancient world, cities that have booming economies and doing well. So what this is saying is basically, from God's perspective, look, you guys are prosperous and doing well, but you're 100% corrupt. You look good on the outside, but you're rotten in the inside, basically. So he says, yet surely I will make thee a wilderness and cities which are not inhabited. So it's going to be destroyed. Your rottenness, I'm gonna blow out this fancy outer shell that makes you seem like you're amazing is going to be crumbled and go away. The rotten inner core, we're going to basically get rid of, make it nothing, and start over. That's what the exile was, is we're going to do a hard reset and get Judah back to following the real God. That was the purpose of the exile that they're about to go through, basically. And we're going to see that as we continue on through the book of Jeremiah and into Ezekiel and them as well. Verse 7, and I will prepare destroyers against thee, every one with his weapons, and they shall cut down thy choice cedars and cast them into fire. So they're going to take the best of Jerusalem and destroy it, ruin it, burn it, make it useless, basically. In fact, Thompson in his book said he would commission destroyers equipped with their weapons of destruction to cut down the choicest cedars and bring them down in the fire. In a sense, therefore, the Babylonians were woodcutters. Psalm 74 is a vivid poetic portrayal of the way the Babylonians destroyed the temple with axes, hatchets, and hammers. That's how they destroyed them. Just like woodcutters would cut down trees, they're cutting down the wood that made the temple and made the spires and things, basically bringing it all down, destroying the city and ruining the wealth of Jerusalem. Verse 8, and many nations shall pass by this city, and they shall say every man to his neighbor, wherefore hath the Lord done thus unto this great city? Now, So let's look at this, okay? Now, actually, let me read verse 9 and then we'll talk about this because there's some cultural understanding to have with verse 8 and 9. Because verse 9 says, Then shall they answer. So imagine people from other nations trekking down the main highways on the way to Egypt or other places, and they go by Jerusalem and they go, Holy crap, why did this country get destroyed like this? Why did the God of the land allow this to happen? The other people in their same party are going to answer him and say, Because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord their God and worshipped other gods and served them. Now we need to be careful how we're perceiving this. This isn't other people going, "Oh, their God is the real God," and they stopped worshiping the real God, and so that's why they got destroyed. This is them saying the God of their land, which they have been told is Jehovah, is not the God they worshipped. They worshipped the gods of other lands, Bel, Molech, Ashtaroth, all those other ones. They worshipped other people's gods in their land instead of the God of the land. Now, in the ancient culture, you had gods over geographical areas. Each land, each group had a god, and the god is over all this land. So when you live in that land, you pay homage to the god of that land. And that's what they're saying is Jerusalem disobeyed the God of the land, and so they were destroyed, basically. That's what they're coming from. So that's the thing you have to think about when you look at verses 8 and 9. That's the perspective, okay, to understand from the culture of the time. Now, verse 10, Weep not for the dead, neither bemoan him, but weep sore for him that goeth away, for he shall return no more, nor seeth his native country. So this is, Thompson had this to say on this verse here from his book, the book of Jeremiah. He says, The dead, singular, refers to Josiah, who was slain at Megiddo in 609 BC. So that's verse 10, Weep not for the dead, neither bemoan him. It's talking about a person that died. The one who has gone away is Jehoahaz, his son, who succeeded Josiah on his death, but was almost immediately deposed by Pharaoh Necho and deported to Egypt 3 months later. Shallum was his personal name, Jehoahaz his throne name. According to 1 Chronicles 3:15, Jehoahaz was Josiah's fourth son, who had been put on the throne by the people of the land. That's 2 Chronicles 36:1. After the death of his father, now some internal political conflict lay behind this. It is possible that Jehoahaz followed his father's reforming policy and was placed on the throne by a faction that supported the reform. Now, just so you're aware, let's look at the history here. Okay, remember, King Josiah was what we would call a righteous king. He wanted the people to follow Yahweh, follow Jehovah. And the people revolted against him legislating religion, basically. So Jehoahaz was put on after Josiah died. Jehoahaz was brought on, and he was, what they think is he probably was encouraging those reforms along. And again, the people didn't want him, and so there was a revolt to get rid of him, to get a king that would allow the people to not worship Yahweh anymore and do what they wanted, basically. Now, this would have been anti-Egyptian in outlook as well, because that would have meant not following Egypt. Jeremiah regarded the deportation of Jehoahaz as more serious than the death of Josiah, and would have the people transfer their mourning from Josiah to the exiled king. The international picture helps in understanding events in Judah. The Babylonian Chronicle makes it clear that in 609 BC, the last king of Assyria, Ashur-uballit, was under severe pressure in Haran, with the Chaldean armies pressing in on him. Egypt hurried to help him, evidently recognizing the danger of the Chaldean advance. So again, when Assyria fell, Egypt and Assyria were not friends. Assyria wanted to deal with Egypt and kind of bring it under its rule, and it kind of did a little bit, but Egypt kept pushing back on it. But when Babylonians marched through, they realized that Babylonians are a worse threat than Assyria. So the enemy of my enemy becomes is so I hate Assyria. Egypt hates Assyria, but Egypt hates Babylon worse. So Egypt fights with Assyria, tries to save Assyria against Babylon. Basically, that's kind of the thought process that was happening there. So the enemy of my enemy, so Babylon's the main enemy. So Egypt and Babylon are severe enemies. And because Babylon and Assyria are severe enemies, Egypt and Assyria are going to be friends. This brought Necho into Palestine, and he quickly assumed control of Syria-Palestine and set up his headquarters at Riblah, modern Rabel, some 47 miles south of Hamath. He called Jehoahaz to meet him there, then deposed him and sent him in chains to Egypt. So he took Josiah after Josiah died in the Battle of Megiddo. He took his son and said, "Nope, you're out. I'm going to put somebody else as king." That was Jehoiakim, if I remember correctly, who became the king. And then when Egypt finally got pushed out, Babylon won. Babylon came down and says, "Nope, we don't like Jehoiakim. You're not being a good guy, so you're out. We're going to, Jehoiahaz was put in, and then he got exiled, basically. There's so many names, so much to think through. Hopefully this is helping you to think through this a little bit more historically. Now let's go into verse 10. Oh, sorry, I read verse 10. Weep not for the dead, neither mourn him, but weep sore for him that goeth away. For he shall return no more, nor see his native country. For thus saith the Lord, so this is verse 11, for thus saith the Lord touching Shallum, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, which reigned instead of Josiah his father, which went forth out of this place, he shall not return thither any more. Now Shallum is actually Jehoahaz. Okay, so mark that in verse 11. Shallum actually is just another name for Jehoahaz. Sometimes people would have different names, basically. Now, verse 12, but he shall die in the place whither they have led him captive, and he shall see his land no more. Verse 13, woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness. Now, this is getting to the next king, which is Jehoiakim, okay, and his chambers by wrong. So this is saying basically the next king is going to build a house with unrighteousness. He's going to build it he's going to enrich himself at the expense of others, basically. So he says here, that useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. So Jehoiakim is going to build a palace and build things up that help him be king, but he's basically going to rip off the people to do it. He's going to convince them, you need to do it or I'm going to kill you, kind of a thing, kind of make them do it rather than be equitable with them. So Jehoiakim was the pro-Egyptian ruler. So he was the one that was put in place by Necho when Necho came in. Because remember, Josiah gets killed in Megiddo. Jehoahaz becomes king. Egypt comes up to help Babylon out, or help Assyria out. In the process, he asks Jehoahaz to come meet with him. They take Jehoahaz to Egypt into exile. And then he puts Jehoiakim in place. And that's why when Babylon comes down, they say, nope, Jehoiakim, you're out, because we don't want a pro-Egyptian king. We want someone who will listen to Babylon. We're going to put your son in place, which is Jehoiachin. But then Jehoiachin ends up in the 597 exile, leaving basically and going to Babylon. I hope that made sense. There's a lot going on, a lot that's going on in here. Okay, so verse 14, thus saith, I will build me a wide house and large chambers, and cutteth him out windows. It is sealed with cedar and painted with vermilion. Now, here's what's interesting is when we look at verses 13 and 14, again, this is Jehoiakim, okay, the pro-Egyptian ruler, that he's ruling in unrighteousness. He is taxing the people. He is forcing the people to work. He is building his palaces at the expense of the people. So he's getting way more value than they are out of this equation, basically. And that's that Master Mahan principle. How can I expend your resources to make me wealthy? That's that Master Mahan principle. If you're not familiar with the Master Mahan principle, go watch our videos about the book of Genesis and the book of Moses to learn where that comes from and that originates. It's going to help you out. So, not a good king. He's not dealing justly with the people. He's not doing a good job of being the king. He's using the people to make himself more cooler, more wealthy, more amazing. Basically, that's not a good situation. You don't want a king. You don't want even a president or ruler that is using people for their own expense to make themselves bigger and better than everybody else, basically. And so verse 14. Let's talk about this because it's talking about making a big, large house, cutting him out windows, uh, using cedar trees to put it on, and painting with vermilion. So Thompson had this to say. He says, excavations at Ramat Rahel in recent years have brought to light evidence of some fine structures from the end of the 7th century, which would illustrate the point made by Jeremiah and may well have been the work of Jehoiakim. So we're finding in archaeological digs the buildings that Jehoiakim probably had the people build at their own expense, but for him. Level 5 of the excavation dates from about 600 BC. Here stood a fortress of the late Israelite period with an exterior wall made of fine masonry, a gateway, and a large building inside. A significant collection of stamped jar handles was found, some bearing the 2-winged royal sign and the letters LMLKHBRN, meaning belonging to the king Hebron. The excavator draws attention to Jeremiah 22:13 through 19 in his report. One wonders where the king obtained funds to build his spacious buildings, since he was required to pay heavy tribute to his Egyptian overlord. And we can learn more in 2 Kings 23 about that. At least the labor cost him nothing, because his fellows worked for nothing and did not receive a wage or their work. Jehoiakim, who was only 25 years old when he began to reign and only 36 when he died, was evidently a thoroughly spoiled and self-indulgent young despot. So he's the spoiled brat that makes everybody do the hard work so that he can benefit from it, basically. Some of the details given in this verse 14, are capable of different translations as well. The verb kara in the second line generally means rend or tear. So when it talks about cutteth him out windows, could mean rend or tear, and it has often been translated as cut out. The same verb in chapter 4, verse 30 means widen or enlarge, like enlarge the eyes with paint. So perhaps we are right to translate that he widens its windows. So make it easier to see by widening what you can see, making the windows bigger. Vermilion, painting this with vermilion. Now, vermilion was a bright red, basically. This was a common practice to use that color in painting and architecture stuff back then, basically. So there's archaeological evidence of what this verse is talking about. Basically, they can't prove, I don't think, 100% that this was during Jehoiakim's time, but it dates to about that time, and it's probably similar to this description. So there's a good plausibility that they have found archaeologically what we're talking about in this chapter, basically. Now, verse 15, shalt thou reign because thou closest thyself in cedar? Did not thy father eat and drink and do judgment and justice, and then it was well with him? So now he's asking this, not quite rhetorical, but almost question of the king, basically. So this is really interesting, is to look at this. Thompson says, the contrast with Josiah begins at this point. The Septuagint differs widely from the Masoretic text, and the translation is conjectural in some places. But the main thrust is clear. Jeremiah makes the point that display of this kind, outdoing everyone in cedar, does not make a man king. Think of your father, Josiah. He lived as a king should. He ate and drank, meaning he lived well as a king, and yet he attended to the important kingly duties of justice and right. Remember that mispat and tzedek that we talked about earlier. That is, he administered these fundamental aspects of national life, and all went well with him. He did not need to outdo other rulers of his day or even his predecessors in luxurious living to be a good king. He was no ascetic, but lived as befitted his royal status, but he took his obligations of king seriously. In particular, he dispensed justice for the poor and needy. This was the true knowledge of God. To know God was to enter into a deep relationship of personal commitment, and this involved a concern to obey the stipulations of the covenant. In Jeremiah's view, Josiah displayed such a knowledge. Jehoiakim did not. Such a eulogy suggests that Jeremiah was sympathetic to a degree with Josiah's reforms. So Jehoiakim wants to look like a great king. Josiah, his dad, was truly a great king. He didn't worry about what he looked like. He worried about taking care of the people. He was a real good king. Jehoiakim doesn't care about the people. He just wants to look good by building grand buildings to himself. So there's, I think, a great contrast and lesson to look at when you think of a ruler who is really going to help you and who is in it to make themselves bigger and better. Some really good ideas and concepts we can think about there. Now verse 16 is a continuation of verse 15. He says, He judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well with him. Was not this to know me, saith the Lord? So that is great. This is what Thompson was talking about there. To know God, to understand him was important. And Josiah was trying to help the people live a way that allowed them to know who God was. Jehoiakim didn't care. He wanted everyone to know who he was, not God. There's a big difference. Big difference. Now, Kent Lefevre actually said this in his article, Justice and Righteousness. He said, to know God is more than knowing about him or being acquainted with him. The term used, da'at, refers to knowledge gained through personal experience. This kind of knowledge is possessed by God himself. That's Psalms 139. But he shares it with humans, Psalms 94 and Proverbs 2. It also appears in the name of the tree in the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the knowledge of God. Genesis 2. By whose fruit Adam and Eve could know good and evil. So this is what verse 16 is getting at, is to know God, to understand him, who he is, have a personal relationship with God was what's important. And that is not what Jehoiakim was doing. He wasn't teaching that, wasn't helping the people with that at all, basically. In verse 7, God's going to point this out. He says, But thine eyes and thine heart are not, but for thy covetousness, and for to shed innocent blood, and for oppression, and for violence to do it. So these are the things that Jehoiakim's guilty of, basically. He's all for extortion, he's all for tyranny, he's all for making himself amazing, but he's not for helping the people truly. In fact, there's a prophet named Uriah. We don't have his book per se in the scriptures, like the book of Uriah. But he was an ancient prophet that was at the time of Jehoiakim as well. He's mentioned in some of the other books, basically, but he doesn't have his own book. He was killed by Jehoiakim. So that was part of the problem there too. That's the innocent. Uriah's in the way of the wealthy becoming wealthier and more powerful, so we're going to find an excuse to have him executed. Now verse 18, so because you're a jerk, Jehoiakim, because you're not good, therefore thus saith the Lord concerning Jehoiakim the son of Josiah, king of Judah. They shall not lament for him, saying, Ah, my brother, or Ah, sister. They shall not lament for him, saying, Ah, Lord, or Ah, his glory. Now that might sound strange. From English, verse 18 doesn't sound right. It sounds weird. So let's talk about verse 18 a little bit more to understand this. Kent Lefevre mentions this in his article, Justice and Righteousness. He says, Therefore, no one shall lament King Jehoiakim, but he shall be buried like a donkey. We're going to see that in verse 19. Verse 19 says, He shall be buried with the burial of an ass, drawn and cast forth beyond the gates of Jerusalem. So what they did to bury a donkey is they dragged it out of the city and tossed it out like trash outside the city. This is the valley of Hinnom, if I remember right, was the valley that they just went out and that was the landfill. You just dumped all your trash and dead animals out there. And eventually it would get destroyed and other animals would come eat all your stuff and it'd just go away. So unfortunately, the king did not humbly receive this call to repent, but was angry at this and other pronouncements from Jeremiah. Now you got to realize Jehoiakim is a king that's full of himself. So this is the words of Jeremiah coming to him saying, dude, you're a jerk. You're an idiot. God doesn't like you. You're not doing good things right. You're going to be out. You think you're a great mighty king, but you're going to be tossed out with the trash. Jehoiakim's not liking this at all. This is not a good situation for him. He's not happy. This discord was the beginning of great animosity between the two men. Later, when a scroll with Jeremiah's words was read to him, Jehoiakim listened, but as each section was finished, he cut it from the scroll with a knife and burned it in the fire. At the end of the reading, he called for Jeremiah's arrest along with that of his scribe Baruch. Now, that's a story that we're going to talk about soon. That's coming up in a future chapter. We're going to get into more details on that one. So, in fact, Thompson made this comment. He said, the final words referring to a donkey's burial raise some questions. Now, according to chapter 36, verse 30, the dead body of Jehoiakim was to be cast out to the heat by day and the frost by night. But according to 2 Kings 24:6, he slept with his fathers, which suggests a normal burial. So there's a problem here. 2 Kings is saying that Jehoiakim was given a royal burial, but Jeremiah is saying he's not getting a royal burial. So there's a contradiction in the Bible right here. This, however, may have been merely a stereotyped formula used in Kings at the end of a reign. So when they did Kings, which is a historical summary, kind of a highlight, the cliff notes of Jewish history at the time, they probably just kind of put it in there and didn't really fully think about it and just mentioned it because it was kind of mentioned with all the kings. It would appear from the Babylonian Chronicle. So the Babylonian Chronicle is an ancient document from the nation of Babylon. This is ancient Babylon writing their own history, and they're mentioning Judah and Jewish stuff in their own history. He says, it would appear from the Babylonian Chronicle that Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem on December 958 BC, by which time Jehoiakim was already dead and Jehoiachin was on the throne, according to 2 Kings 24. A ready solution is that as the Babylonian armies approached, the pro-Babylonian party in Jerusalem organized an assassination of Jehoiakim in a palace revolt. At the time Jehoiakim had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. In that case, so that's 2 Kings 24, in that case, an ignominious death may have been followed by an ignominious burial. Although in such circumstances an official burial could easily have been described by Jeremiah as the burial of an ass, the statement that he would be dragged out and dumped outside the gates of Jerusalem accords well with the statement in chapter 36. So we see this idea that it maybe 2 Kings and Jeremiah aren't in so much contradiction to each other. 2 Kings could just be the scribes just kind of massaged over it with that and moved on. But it could be too, when you look at the Babylonian history and compare that maybe they did throw him out. According to Babylon's history, Jeremiah is more correct rather than 2 Kings, basically. So that's what's happening here, basically. So a little bit of interesting history. Now let's go to verse 20. So there's a bit of a change coming in verse 20. Go up to Lebanon and cry. Lift up thy voice in Bashan and cry from the passages, for all thy lovers are destroyed. So this is talking about Judah in a general sense. This is going back to the concept of Judah as the bride. Okay? That's what we're getting at here. So Jerusalem is being portrayed as a woman, saying, go cry to your lovers. Go cry to the people you've been caring about all this time. Now that you're in the middle of being destroyed, go cry to those who supposedly were your friends and your lovers, basically. Now go up to Lebanon. So there's direction, go up. So this is, go to Lebanon. This is northeast in Transjordan, the mountain range in Moab, overlooking the Dead Sea. Moses viewed the promised land from Mount Nebo, which is the highest peak in these mountains. That's where this is. Now, that's lift up thy voice in Bashan, okay? So this is dealing with political allies, these lovers and other people, okay? That's where they're coming from. So, and that's where Bashan and that area is the Transjordan up that way as well. So, again, these are the people that were supposedly the friends of Judah, and in Judah's time of need, they bailed. They didn't help at all. Nebuchadnezzar routed all of these, in fact, after the collapse of Egyptian forces at Carchemish in 605 BC. Ashkelon followed. Areas in Transjordan were soon vassals of Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem was deserted, isolated, and alone. Basically, they didn't stand a chance. Now, verse 21 is going to continue this same idea. So, I spake unto thee in thy prosperity, but thou saidst, I will not hear. So this is Judah is the woman, the bride, and he's going, I tried to tell you when times were good, but you didn't listen to me. Basically, this hath been thy manner from thy youth, O thou obeyest not my voice. So Judah has not been a good bride. Judah has not been faithful to her man, her husband, which is God or Christ, basically. Verse 22, the wind shall eat up all thy pastors, and thy lover shall go into captivity. Surely then shalt thou be ashamed and confounded for all thy wickedness. Now, these terms are used, if you think about this, this is kind of taken a perspective of a shepherd. Okay, a shepherd to round up and take away. This is Babylonian exile. Thy lovers go into captivity. A lot of those nations that were mentioned, we talked about, they all were made vassal states of Babylon as well. They were brought into captivity, basically also. So this is what's interesting is Babylon is being talked as if it was wind. Wind is a natural consequence of other things moving. It isn't really a thing of itself, but a result of other choices or things moving. Interesting analogy here. Babylon will conquer Judah due to Judah's choices to not follow God. It'll be a natural consequence of gross disobedience. That's when you think of this idea of the wind shall eat up all thy pastors. Babylon, this natural consequence is going to come and destroy you and destroy those who are teaching, the teachers of the religion. That's the pastors. Why? Because they're teaching the false religion. They got to get rid of these people, get them out. And all of your friends, your lovers, the people you've been hanging out with and wanting to be with, they're going into captivity too. You're going to have no friends, no one to help you. Surely then shalt thou be ashamed and confounded for all thy wickedness. So when the exile comes, when they're marching to Babylon because everything's been wiped out, that is when Judah is going to realize they were wrong. They followed the wrong people. Now that really, you want to recognize this long before the destruction happens. But they didn't. And so now they're destroyed, and now they admit we were listening to the wrong people. We went the wrong way. They can't change it now. It's already gone. Judah's been destroyed. The walls are down. The place has been burned to the ground. Millions of people, lots of people have been killed or put into exile. A lot of problems. Now, verse 23, O inhabitant of Lebanon. Now, Lebanon's not referring to the place Lebanon. Lebanon is used metaphorically in place of Jerusalem. That makest thy nest in the cedars. How gracious shalt thou be when pangs come upon thee, the pain as of a woman in travail. So we're looking at this idea of a woman giving birth, basically. How gracious are you going to be when you're in the middle of labor, basically? And any woman will tell you you can't be gracious in that time frame. That's not the time for etiquette and pose. You're in pain. You're hurting, especially since that in the ancient world, they had children without epidurals, without hypnosis. It was just something you had to deal with, basically. That's, ladies, what do you think about that? I'd love to hear in the comments what your thoughts would be of if you had to have all children natural, no hypnosis, no hypnobirthing, no epidurals, no nothing. How, can you be gracious in that moment? Can you be refined and and etiquette. You follow etiquette in that time. That's again, this is the problem that Judah's going to have, is they're not going to have the luxury and during the destruction to admit and realize what's going on, basically. So now it's interesting they keep bringing up cedars. Jerusalem not only had a ton of cedar from Lebanon in the city, which is interesting, almost like a little Lebanon. They had cut so much wood and brought it down with King Solomon and other kings. There was a lot of cedar from Lebanon in Jerusalem. But they were also opulent in their wealth, like Lebanon. Because Lebanon had that resource of the forests, these cedar forests are amazing. They had a lot of wealth and opulence. And Jerusalem is acting as if they're like Lebanon. And that's why in this verse they're metaphorically calling Jerusalem Lebanon. So really interesting metaphor. You're opulent, you're amazing, you're spectacular, you're looking good, but you're also giving birth. You're also suffering pain, severe pain. So could a woman go to a ball, wear a gown, look refined, and have labor at the same time? How would that be, ladies? I'm looking forward to your comments on that one. Hear what you have to say. Now, verse 24, as I live, saith the Lord. That's a good statement. God is admitting he is real. Though Coniah the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet upon my right hand, yet would I pluck thee thence. So let's look at this one. This is, again, God's not happy with what's going on in Jerusalem. So this is Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim's son. Sometimes he's called Coniah. We see that sometimes. So Coniah is the shortened version of his name, basically. Sometimes Jeconiah is another term that we'll sometimes see in the Old Testament about him. He reigned for 3 months, basically, before Jerusalem fell in 597. So he was really interesting. He was about 18 years old when he became, or when he went into exile. So he was around 17, 18 years old when he became the king. He was the king for 3 months, then went into exile to Babylon, basically. It's interesting, but he may actually have had a son by this time, but his son would have been so young, he couldn't be king. So that's when his Nebuchadnezzar made his uncle, Mattaniah, who's changed to Zedekiah, king in 597, around that time, basically. Now, Jehoiachin, is related, the metaphor is relating him to a signet. Now, a signet was a ring on your finger, basically. This is the one where you'd get the wax and you'd put the imprint on it to seal your letters, to seal official documents. That's the signet, basically. So what this is saying this is the royal stamp. And God is saying, if you, as the king, were the royal stamp I had to deal with, I wouldn't deal with you. You're not my representative. Talk about a lack of confidence that God has in them. Oh, man. In fact, God continues on in verse 25, talking about Jehoiachin. He says, and I will give thee into the hand of them that seek thy life, and into the hand of them whose face thou fearest, even into the hand of Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, into the land of the Chaldeans. So he is literally pulling him out of Jerusalem and putting him into Babylon. I'm going to cast you out. In verse 26, I will cast thee out, and thy mother that bare thee, into another country, where ye were not born, and there shall ye die. Now, if you remember, we've talked about this in the last chapter too. There were a group of people who believed, because he was the son of the rightful king, this whole father-son idea of kingship, that Jehoiachin was the actual real king of Judah, and Zedekiah was just a placeholder king until Jehoiachin could come back. Now, what we're learning in here, Jeremiah is telling them Jehoiachin's not returning. He's not coming back. He is going to stay in exile and die in exile. Now, the thing that's fascinating, and we're going to talk about this more when we get into Matthew, when you look at the genealogy, it's through Jehoiachin that the bloodline is preserved, which allows Christ to be a son of David. So the kingship is still, that bloodline did get preserved, but it didn't receive the kingship anymore. After Zedekiah, there really wasn't much of a king of Israel anymore as far as that official throne of David. The bloodline retained, which is what Matthew tries to prove, but the being a king wasn't ever there anymore, basically, after this. So verse 27, but to the land whereunto they desire to return, thither shall they not return. So his mom and everybody else, they're not coming back either. So verse 28, is this man Coniah a despised broken idol? Is he a vessel wherein is no pleasure? Wherefore are they cast out, he and his seed, and are cast into a land which they know not? So this is kind of a question that's being asked. So now this is interesting because the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, differs from the Masoretic text, which is where the English translation came from. The Septuagint is brief on this. It says, is Coniah despised as a vessel for which there is no use? So it stops there. It doesn't continue on. So verse 28 is short. One sentence versus several lines in the longer Hebrew version the Masoretic text was based on. So the longer Hebrew text seems to obscure the meter. Probably the general sense of the text is clear. Coniah and his family have been cast out as something unwanted and sent to a land unknown. The parable with the rejected flask of chapter 19 is clear enough. So he's out. He's gone, basically. Now, continuing on in this chapter here, O earth, 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 hear the word of the Lord. That's verse 29. Verse 30, thus saith the Lord, write ye this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. Now, Thompson had some comments to say about this. He said that Coniah will be recorded as childless. The sense is not that he will have no sons. In fact, he had 7. According to 1 Chronicles, Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim, he had 7 sons. So this isn't saying he's not going to have any children, but he's not going to have anybody who sits on the throne anymore, basically. So he says, in fact, he had 7 sons, and receipts for the issue of oil to captives in Babylon bear testimony to at least 5 sons. The eldest of his sons may have been born already when this prophecy was delivered. Jehoiachin was, however, childless as far as having a descendant to sit on the throne of David. Zerubbabel, his grandson, returned after the exile as a kind of high commissioner, but not as king. Jeremiah's statement came from his belief that it was Yahweh's plan not to allow a descendant of Jehoiachin to be king. It is possible that Jeremiah's words were directed particularly to those who held out the hope that Jehoiachin might return and restore the Davidic dynasty. Some in Judah would not accept the fact that Zedekiah had been appointed king. Jeremiah cut short all such speculations by an unambiguous rejection of both Jehoiachin and his descendants. The word here translated childless, when it says, write ye this man childless, could also be translated stripped of all honor. However, the rest of the verse has to do with his lack of an heir. He was a man who did not prosper in his own lifetime, nor through his offspring. So Jehoiachin is out. He is still around. He had children, but they will no longer occupy the throne. So when the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 597 BC, the throne of David ended. No one would be king. The bloodline was still there. So he'd be a relative of King David, but the throne was not there. And if you go look in the book of Matthew, he tries to build the genealogy to show Jesus Christ is a descendant of David through the line of the kings, basically. So if Matthew's right, then Joseph is of the lineage, his earthly father, if you will, is of the lineage to be a rightful king of Judah, which means Christ would be the rightful king of Judah if he's seen as the son of Joseph. But we're going to get into more into that and those discussions also more. But just realize that this is the time of the history when we're going to talk about it in Matthew, but this is the time of history that it happened. That's what's going on here in Jeremiah's time, basically. So I know this video went long, which if you've watched all the Isaiah ones, this is kind of a normal length video, unfortunately. A lot of fun things for us to talk about to really understand history of this time and some of the metaphors and ideas, the concepts of what was going on. So I hope you're enjoying these. We'll see you in the next chapter.